Yeah, so you guys, if you haven't figured it out, get me for this staffy. So as I was kind of thinking about what to bring for this one, I just kind of was reminded that I think one of the questions I get asked the most is how I stay calm under pressure and not look frazzled, or how I seem to still serve with like a joy and a smile when it seems like everything is kind of chaotic. And so the topic that kind of came to mind off of that was like leading in the overwhelming. So I'm going to talk kind of from that lens, because I don't think by any means I have it figured out, but it is one of the things that people often tell me, that I stay cool, calm, and composed. And I'm like, but it's not always that way in the head. So I'm glad that it comes out that way in the pressure. But I just kind of wanted to talk through a bit of like what that journey is like for me, and how I'm glad that it interprets that way, because that is ultimately a goal, to like still feel like I'm leading level-headed in what can be high pressure, overwhelming times, both from like circumstantial in like what's actually happening maybe on the day of, like when the air conditioning goes out in the building and you're trying to figure out all the different things, to even just like things in personal life. How do you still show up and show up well for what that season is, well in that season, right? And so I'm going to talk about leading through the overwhelming, and I'm going to end kind of on the practicals of it, but I wanted to talk through a bit of like, I think for me, where that spiritual side comes in first, because ultimately I think that is the biggest difference maker. And the thing that I would say is that to lead in the overwhelming, you have to lead your soul first. Like, it's not just about leading the emotions or the head, even though that is part of it. Because you can let your mind start going down the rabbit hole of like worst case scenarios and start, spinning out of like, this is the worst. The emotions want you to go into, I think, overdrive of the drama, the panic, I think they're natural cues. Your body's trying to protect itself. It's trying to be like, I don't know what to do in this situation. I think we naturally go into like fight or flight mode. So depending on what we're faced with, we're either like, yeah, I'm ready to take it on, and maybe we go in a little too intense. And other times we're like, I just want to bury my head in the sand and ignore this. I'm going to fly away and hope that this can just fix itself without me kind of scenario. But I think the thing that really has been a difference maker for me is thinking about every day, how am I leading the soul space that's ultimately going to be leading those emotions and the mental space? Because if my soul's not good when I show up, everything else starts to kind of fall apart, right? It's easier to have the short attitude or the moodiness or the quick witty response that maybe is too harsh, right? When we're not good in the soul space. And so what does that look like? For me, one of the biggest things, I think, probably in the last 2 to 3 years specifically, as I think life sent some curveballs, that I think I was like, man, I find this pattern in church that people come in and they're super on fire, right? That's a word we hear a lot. We're on fire, we're hungry, we're ready for it. So we're out there, we're serving, we're giving it all. And then it's I wouldn't say overnight, because sometimes you can see it written on the wall of they're not quite strong in their soul space. But for them, it feels like overnight, everything just falls apart. And they're like, oh, I'm worn out. I can't do this anymore. And I think it's because they, kind of what Pastor Jake spoke about on Sunday, you get busy doing the work. And so you're out there toiling, and you're taking on maybe the people problems that you're hearing, and you're pastoring in that sense that I think Pastor Chris has talked a lot about, leading and pastoring in these staffies. And we walk away with a lot. And I think what we don't do is go into, as Pastor Jake was saying, the house well. And we don't actually lay those things before God and say, this isn't actually what I'm supposed to be carrying. This is part of what you've asked me to carry, but I'm not supposed to be the one who's actually taking on the burden of it. Yeah. And I think through the years I found that when I showed up more frazzled, it's because I thought I was the one having to figure it out, fix it, solve it, figure out that best solution. That it's if I don't have the answer, how's this going to fix it? It's on me. And it's no, it's not actually on me. Ultimately, God's the one who is going to bring the harvest. He's the one who's going to bring revival, right? I can't stir that up. And so I think while we can fan the flame, I think I've noticed that a lot of people get too fixated on like, I just need to feel like I'm on fire.
Yeah.
And I think that while that's great and you need to feel on fire, that isn't ultimately what we're chasing. Right? We're chasing our relationship with Jesus and with God. And I think the thing to know is that fires just don't stay lit by themselves.
Yeah.
Right? And I think the biggest thing there is that we have to be committed to producing the oil. Right. The oil is actually what lights the lamp, that lights that flame. And I think when I talk about the oil in the Bible, it's often that metaphor of the Holy Spirit, and it's producing those fruits of the Spirit. And so when I say like actually being committed to producing the oil, it's like getting before God in that like secret place and being like, I'm actually in that relationship that produces that oil, but that's where that flame and that passion, that fire comes from. And I think we want to feel the feels of the fire and the flame and like, I'm so passionate, but we often will skip those moments when it's hard to get in his presence, when we don't feel it, when we're like, man, I feel life is overwhelming and busy, and I'm hit with too much, so I can't get in his presence. We're like, I think even to the point that sometimes we find it easier to go to him, right? When we're passionate, we're like, yeah, let's keep this going, right? But often I think you get the biggest fruit and the most oil is produced at like actually staying committed to going before I'm going, as Pastor Jake was saying, like back into the house and being like, why am I really doing this? It's because I'm in a relationship with God. Yes. And everything else that flows, any serve role that I could be on, that's going to flow from my relationship with God. Yeah. How I show up on those Sundays, on those Wednesdays, on those Tuesdays for college students, like that's going to flow actually from my quiet time with God. It is so easy to just start going through those motions. And then as life gets busier, suddenly the going through the motions is starting to take you out because you're like, I'm just running on a hamster wheel. Yeah. And this is getting harder and more is being asked of me. And I'm like stepping up in leadership, but I'm just going through this like hamster wheel. And it's like, I don't actually know how to sustain it. And that's where it's like, I can't lead. I can't lead like this. This is too much. I don't have it in me. Maybe this isn't the right thing for me, right? Instead, being like, it's not about any of that. But God, are you asking me to do this? God, is this the next thing for me? Am I actually doing it from a place of like, I know why you called me to this. I know why for college students. I know why I'm in college this year. So on the Tuesdays when it's a busy week, that I'm going to still show up being like, I'm ready to learn. Yeah. I'm ready to like get in your presence, God. I'm ready to like actually look at my neighbors, my other fellow college students, to be like, how are you? How's life going? Like, how can I pray for you? How can we continue to show up as the church? But I found that when, that soul space is cluttered, everything else gets harder to lead from, right? And overwhelming. And so from that, God wants your relationship first and foremost above everything. And so I find it interesting because when you look at Genesis and Adam and Eve, right, have this unique relationship with God before everything, before the fall, we mess up. They're living like the best life, right? And God is actually going into the garden and walking with them. And they're getting that close proximity to him. And they're like actually in this communion with him that is like, I think, just so representative of how he wants us to be in relationship. And I often think about one of the first arguments each one I ever had. Dating. We're in a relationship series. Here you go. This is an add-on bonus. So we were dating for a few months. And I remember specifically it was like maybe a Sunday after church or whatever. We had gone to Big Star, got tacos, sat down to eat. And I knew he was like, I was like, oh, he's in serious mode. And it was over, like, to me at the time, I'm like, this is such a petty thing. But then it hit me, I'm like, I know why this matters. So he was upset because through the weeks, I wouldn't text or call very often. And I'm like, aren't you happy I'm not a clingy, needy girlfriend? Like, that's what's going on in my head. I'm like, I think I'm being a pretty good girlfriend. I'm checking in the morning, you text, like, how's your morning going? After, I'll be like, hey, how was your day? But, like, that wasn't enough. And I'm like, I'm like, and I'm also trying not to be strong, independent Shannon at the time of, like, I got a busy life. Like, I'm giving you some communication. But as we started talking about it, it was like, he just genuinely wanted to know that, like, I wanted to be talking to him, that I missed him, that, like, I cared how his day was going. And it wasn't enough to wait to date night to, like, unpack how, like, the week was going. He actually wanted, like, real-time conversation and, like, actual, like, I know how, like, did you have a bad day? I want to know about it that day, not on Friday, that you had a terrible Tuesday. Right? Like, he was saying, like, I actually want to be in relationship with you. And I think that's how we treat God often. It's a check-in, check-out relationship that often we're doing our prayer in the morning, like, I'm pumped, let's have a great day, or like, I pray for my meetings to go well or whatever, work, and then at night we might be like, yeah, I think, great day, God. Thanks for a wonderful day. And I feel like that's how I was doing in my relationship. And it just hit me of like, God wants that proximity of like, even in the hard and the overwhelming, how often do we pause and we say, all right, God, this is a really tough day, or like, this is the best day. Like, thank you for that conversation, God. Thank you for, just bringing that my way. I think we go through it so fast that, and the reason this ties to like leading the overwhelming is I think that if you can't bring God into your day-to-day and you can't have that closeness, it's gonna feel overwhelming because you're doing it alone, right? And so actually being able to pause and say, all right, God, I could go into Shannon's gonna fix it mode because I'm an achiever. I'm like, I could be quick. I'm like, let me just figure my way out of this. And I tried that for years to be like, I'm just gonna quickly think of an answer. And then it wasn't until later that I just paused and like, you know what? I didn't actually stop and pray and be like, God, is there a better way to do this? Or God, is there a God way to do this? Yeah. It was like, I had this burden of like, I've got to be the one to step in and fix it without being, I think, a leader who was quick at asking God, like, all right, how should I handle this?
Yeah, very good.
It wasn't until after that I'd be like, I think probably could have done that a bit better, right? And so I say that because God wants that proximity. He wants that communication. He wants that relationship with you. I find it interesting that when Adam and Eve, right, they eat the apple, one of the first things they do is when God comes back into the garden, they hide from him, right? And I think that's our like innate go-to. It's like when things get tough, I think we kind of go into like, maybe we have shame about something, maybe we have like, just like, I find it also interesting that they made their own clothes. They're like, I'm gonna fix this and maybe he won't notice. And he's like, why are you wearing leaves? Like, I've never done that before. And so I think we kind of do that. We're like, I'm gonna fix this and maybe, all better. And God's like, why don't you just ask me? Why don't you just come to me first? And I could probably have a better solution of like, hey, just ask my forgiveness and you don't need to like cover it up. But I think we're very quick to do that instead of going to him first. And so I say that because I'm like, all of this is really, don't get so caught up in the work that you forget about the soul space of it. And I think we've been kind of talking through that a lot on like, how do you lead from the mountaintop? And something about that whole like series that we kind of, I don't know if it's a series, but that conversation that we started like go up the mountain. In reality, I'm like, I'm tired of walking up this mountain, God. Like we've made jokes about like, I'm slipping on tears on my way up this mountain. Like this is hard work. But it's like much as we joked about it, I'm like, dang, the more conversations and meetings that I would leave, be like, I just got to go up the mountain again and get God on this. I'm like, I actually have to be going up and getting that alone time with him a lot.
Yes.
A whole lot more than I think in reality I was doing. So it helped put really good like language, I think, to more than just like, I'm going to go pray about it. The reason I like the mountaintop, it was like, I actually have to make way for that room with him. And I actually, like Moses on the mountaintop, like not give it a time limit. And I think when I used to be like, I'll go pray about it, it was like in my head, like that quick, all right, God, could you just like fix this for me? Or like show me a better way? Or like, hey, can you do it? It wasn't like I lingered with him. The mountaintop makes me think about Moses lingering with God and like making that hike, setting that time apart with him. And so I think while yes, those quick check-in and prayers through the day are amazing, what I'm trying to say is like, actually that transformation in your soul, like how are we actually carving out the time that we need to actually wait for the response to make sure we're good? And so this is where my practicals kind of come in, because as we kind of, I think, put a bit of the language to like that difference between those, I think, moments where they're really good, like heart checks. Again, I am all for like the 2 minutes on the walk to the bathroom being like, God, help my attitude right now, right? Like, we need those. But I also think it's as much about like, did I actually make a way to set apart time? Like, I think about those early dating years with Detroit. It was like, it wasn't that hard. What he was asking me to do wasn't that hard, right? Like, it wasn't hard. But in my mind in that moment, I'm like, do you know how busy I am? Like, it's not that I don't care about you, but like, I'm going from one meeting to the next. And he's looking at me like, what I'm hearing is you don't care enough to pause and stop and be with me. And like, even if it's not the physical like moment, it's like the actual like, I again went away, took 2 minutes maybe to send him a message about the day or call him and spend 10 minutes on the phone even. It's like, again, what I'm talking about is like, it was not hard things, but in my mind, I was like, I'm so busy. And I feel like that's how we are with God a lot. It's like, I'm so busy doing your work, God. When do you want me to spend time with you? And he's over there like, it's not even about the work. I'm asking you to be with me, and all the work is a like product of your time with me. And you could be doing the work, spinning your wheels again for the work, but the work often goes faster, smoother, is more fun, is more enjoyable. That's what I'm saying, the overwhelming, like the weeks where like the biggest things get thrown at us, I find are easier when I'm like, I'm good because I've been with God. And like, this sucks. And like, wasn't a like thing I needed to handle today, wasn't on my to-do list today, but all right, God, like we're going to take this on because it's coming from like a better space of like, all right, God, instead of that complaining like, oh, again, really? Another building thing? God, can't you just fix the building thing? I've been praying for the building thing for years now. Like, instead of that like posture, I found that then it turns into like, all right, God, till you have that next thing for us, let's tackle today's. Like Pastor Chris has been saying, like, how do we make the most of this season? And believing like it's the last of these seasons. It's such a game changer of like, I think looking at it like, let's hope, God, it's the last time the AC goes out in the building. But like, if this is our last season to deal with all the different obstacles that come from not owning a building, like, let's again I just love the way our team was so agile, was there. But it's like, man, God, like Shannon said, we got to praise God in a way that, you know, I think we're not often faced with. We get the luxury and the comfort of things that don't actually make us see how hard we want it or how much we want it. And so I think really setting out that time of like, man, God, I'm going and creating space for you. And so just to the practicals of like, what do you do when you're creating that space and you're facing the overwhelming? These are some of the practicals that I found through that time. It's like, as I'm sitting there and I think I get before God, I have like something attached to my earring. So something that I think I found in those moments is like, I always just start with worship. And I find it like the equivalent often, even if it's not like a praise song, but it's like me just like saying like, I praise you, God, you're worthy. You're so like amazing. Like all the praise, right? I find it the equivalent like getting my feet. Because I think the overwhelming often hits us and we feel like we've gotten shaken a bit or like we've lost our balance a little bit. We feel a little disoriented because we don't really know. In the overwhelming, you don't often know what to tackle first, right? That's why it's overwhelming. You're like, there's too many things. I don't know which one to go, right? And so I think you enter into his presence and it's often like, a bit unclear of like, what am I even trying to pray about? What am I even, it's just like steadying your soul to be like, my problems are so little compared to who you are, God. And I think even goes back to one of those messages that Pastor Gio spoke about of like little God syndrome, like elevating his name so that we're not, he's not little. These problems that we're facing like are so little compared to who he is and what he can do. And so I find it, like that equivalent of like, you get your feet on the ground and you're like, I'm steadfast in you, God. Like I've got my balance. Like I'm worshiping you, I'm praising you. It like takes me out of that like overwhelming feeling and sets him there first. Second, I just kind of sit and I'm like trying to identify like what is overwhelming? Like, and then again, a very practical, like I'll kind of go through like what feels overwhelming to me, like that, like what is making me feel that like worry or that anxiety or like that stress? Like what's that feeling? Where is that coming from? What looks overwhelming? So often I'll be like, why does it look that way? Like in the physical, like I think sometimes I'm like, you see things, you walk into the room and you're like, oh, it looks overwhelming. Like sometimes you can't tangibly, but like as you start to process it, you're like, it's this thing about that makes me hit like overwhelming, I even go like, what do you hear is overwhelming? I think it's funny, we laughed about this the other week. We were doing I wasn't actually there, so this is a secondhand story, but Pastor Eva was doing a Carmona Grow Group huddle and all the kids were running around and she pauses, she's like, we good? Like, you guys listen? And she said, all the parents are like locked in. Like, they don't even hear everything. She's the only one that hears the chaos going on. And all the parents are like, what do you mean? And you're like, she's like, this is overwhelming. Your kids are running around. And the rest of us are like, we're like, and it's real. But as a parent, like, it's funny how like I only have one. And some days I'm like, you hear overwhelming. But then you max, like 5 kids to me can be overwhelming. But the parent of 5 is like, what do you mean? Like this is everyday normal life. So like what in your life, like do you hear that gets you in that overwhelming spot of like, is it the feedback? And you hear that as overwhelming. And you're like, I don't know how to process that, which we'll talk about in a second. But like, what is it that like hits you and it brings you into that like, I can't even hear my own thoughts, right? And so like try to identify those pieces that get you into that spot. And then lastly, like, what makes your mind think its way to overwhelming? I think that there are certain things that, in this day and age, we talk about triggers a lot, but like I think that there are things that when we hear them, they take us back to a place that was overwhelming. And so this thing may not even be related, but because it was phrased the same way, because it showed up the same way, suddenly your mind is like already going down the rabbit trail of like, I'm overwhelmed. And the person's looking at you like, I literally said one sentence. I don't know how it is this hard, but you're like, I am overwhelmed. And they're like, what about what I said is overwhelming? And so I think when you're in that space with God, it's such a great moment to be like, all right, God, like help identify, reveal to me what these things are because they're coming from somewhere. And I found that everything that has like taken me to that sense of like, this is overwhelming, I don't know what to do with, are moments that often are things that like, I still need healing in or things that like I don't have the confidence in myself. And so I'm like, God, give me more of like your identity to like show up and know that I have the authority to do that. One of like the times, I think it was October of 2022 that I preached, like we did the Anomaly series. And Xavier Durant came up to me and he was like, right before I was supposed to take stage, she's like, you have authority. And I kind of laughed, was like, yeah. And he's like, he looked at me, he's like, no, this is a word for you. I said, he's like, God told me to tell you have the authority. And I was like, you're right, X. Like, I was like, thank you. Because I was like, it's those moments, it's like, I think if I had taken the stage without that word, I would have looked at the crowd and been like, what do I have any right to be on this stage talking? And I think there are moments as leaders, we walk into scenarios and we hit this overwhelming, like, I don't have any reason to be the one supposed to be making the final say on this. And so tapping into like, actually God, like, what is it that makes me hesitate? What is it that feels that way? And often it's those things that he's trying to say, like, I've given you the authority and the strength and the boldness to do. but actually it's not in our own strength or our authority and boldness to do it. We actually need his. And so praying for like, all right, God, strengthen me and bolden me, like give me your authority to walk into these spaces and to lead that way. I think actually helping ourselves shift through those things, I find has helped me. Then when I am faced with it again, I don't get overwhelmed as quickly. So yeah, you can look at different scenarios, and I think all three of us would attest to like things in 2021 that felt overwhelming as an executive team. Now we're like, all right, we know how to do that this time. Like, but it was a series of like feeling like I don't know what we're doing because we did it, and like figuring it out and stumbling our way through, but actually being like, all right, God, like help me grow through this. And so that the next time we're hit with those things, we don't get that like deer in the headlights, like,
very good.
You know what to do? You know, okay, we're just, we'll just wing our way through it, right? But like actually be like, all right, God, like help me know how to grow through this.
Yeah.
What is it you're trying to teach me through this? And then the next time I'm faced with it, I'm like, I know this now. And I think the enemy loves to use that sense of like overwhelming, can't function, to like try to remove us, try to like take us out in that sense, to try to dampen that fire again, try to like put some, I think, just barrier between us and God of like, because I think most people, when we start to feel overwhelmed, we start to shut down a little. Like if we're honest, right? Like in some capacity, we kind of shut down and we're like, there's a malfunction in some part. We're like, I don't know. And so, but I think it also happens in our relationship to God. We're like, I don't even know God, what, like, I don't know. And so you're kind of like, I'm just gonna kind of move along and see what happens. And I think instead of going to him, often we're kind of like, I don't even know how to approach you with this yet, because I don't know what you're trying to do with this. And so that was practical number one. Practical number two is like, take note of when that fight or flight mode happens for you. I think that there are things that because of our personalities and our gifts and our strengths, again, there are things that like are going to happen and it kicks us into that fight mode. And we get like, and it can be beautiful because like, when they're getting stuff done, like this is great. But be careful about that if you're an achiever, especially, or like high responsibility, because you could be getting stuff done, but you're actually so not good in your soul space. Like you are using the getting it done to kind of mask the fact that you're not good, right? You're like, because you almost slowing down would make you have to address what's not good. And so you often will go into a fight mode because it's like your survival. It's like, if I fight my way through this, I'm going to make it to the other side. When really God's like, I just need you to sit with me for a second and unpack and let me like heal you, let me tend to it, let me like strengthen you, let me love you through it. And I think sometimes as an achiever, we use it as a way, again, like, I'm doing your work, God, so we're good. And he's like, no, just come sit with me for a minute, and then you can go back and be the achiever and love doing all of it with me. But like, be careful when you're doing the work for God, but not with him. And then for those that's like the flight mode, I think that there are things that make us just, again, want to bury our head in the sand, ignore them, or quit. And they become patterns in our life. That like, there are certain things that every time that thing may be camouflaged slightly different each time, but there's a theme that's like, when I'm faced with this type of thing, my innate reaction is that like deer in the headlights, like I'm just going to run away from it. I'm going to ignore that's happening. I'm going to sidestep the conversation and not actually talk about it, and then hopefully enough times pass that we just move on and we never talk about it. But then that same thing's going to show up in a different friend, and I'm going to do that same thing to that friend until I've sidestepped all my friends, and it's all for some of the same conversations that I should have just had with each and every one of them, that I'm just avoiding the conflict or whatever it might be. That makes me go into flight mode. To actually take note of those, because those are the things you need to bring to God and be like, man, everything in me wants to run away right now. Everything in me is dreading that conversation. And you bring that before God and you pray and you're like, man, God, like, show me how you want me to do this. Show me the best way, God, for your glory to be had in this situation, right? Number 3, feedback. Overwhelming feedback, because I think that is something that I've noticed tends to be an area where, the feathers get ruffled, the feelings get hurt, it starts to feel overwhelming. You start to feel like, man, am I doing anything right? Like, am I winning at anything? Just one thing would be, And I think I have found that I, as a leader, have made... I was an athlete growing up, soccer player, and it just always makes me go back to, like, the video replay is the feedback loop. And if any good team watched their videos of their game and took note of everything, went through, like, every play by play of, like, this, you guys did beautifully, let's, again, celebrate and replicate it. Others that are so cringe to watch. And, like, in your head, that's not what you did. You're like, you're watching this video and you're like, I was not there. Like you're like, right, I'm a goalie and I also played midfielder, and I'm like, there would be video replay where I'm like, I was so far wide that I could have just been out of the field. I was running the line, but my team needed me to be further in for a cross, and I'm like, in my head, that is not where I was standing. And then you watch the video and you're like, huh. But I guess, like, the video's not lying. That's what I was doing. And you're like, what were you doing? Were you off in La La Land? And so I think the feedback is, like, great at locating, like, those blind spots for you. Because you can think that you nailed something. You can think that you said something a certain way, and they're like, no, that's not how that came out. Or like, nope, that was sloppy transition, all the things. It could be even just, I think, our attitude. It could be like, I thought I was good that day. And somebody would be like, your face was saying something entirely different. And I think we need that feedback because we're often blind to the things that we're just blind to. We don't know, right? And until you see it, and I think all that to say, like, the feedback, again, watching some of those videos, I have memories of, like, literally, like, physically, like, watching, cringing, and being like, oh my gosh, how the heck did I miss that shot? What was I doing? But it's like, without seeing it, you don't know, like, where your innate, like, I think, like, propensities are. To be like, okay, when I'm in this relationship and we talk about these things, you're like, how long do we have to talk about this? Can it be done? And it's like, there's probably something there that you need to clean out and you need to take before God and be like, go away again and ask God, like, what about this feedback is making me feel really overwhelmed? What about this feedback is actually, it's not even about the feedback, but it's about something else that feedback is trying to tell me that I actually maybe believe about myself.
Right, cool.
They told me that I had an attitude, and it wasn't even that I had an attitude. It was that, like, I just was, I show up and I haven't prayed that morning. I wasn't actually there. I think often we show up and we're like, oh, but I was there, but, like, you're not actually there. There's part of you that you've left out of the building, whether it's like, did I actually show up with all of me for this, or am I just going through the motions again? And maybe that's, like, touching on that you're like, that feedback is overwhelming because you're like, I made it. That was the best that I could do, is I made it in the door. I'm like, okay, well, that's something to talk about the season that you're in and what's actually going on. And when you lead people, I think it's never always about the thing that it started off about. Sometimes when you're getting feedback, you end up in these conversations that you're like, yeah, that is not what I thought we were going to be talking about in this meeting, but actually this is the thing we have to talk about because this is going back to a hurt you had at 14 or something, and you're like, oh, okay, let's talk about that thing, because that's actually why I'm getting this response from you every time I say this to you. It's not actually about the thing. It's about something so much deeper that you believed about yourself, and so that's impacting how you're showing up. So actually take the feedback as like a game replay and be like, all right, God, what about that And I think it's not always in the moments, right? Busy Sundays, sometimes there's times where I just note like, I had an internal reaction to something that in the moment I'm not maybe going to address because it's something that I know. Again, in the God time, I'm like, all right, God, I've taken note though. Like,
That's good.
Why did that feel a little sharp?
That's good.
And I know that wasn't their intent, and I also know that like this isn't the first time I've had that response to that person.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to take those things and kind of note them.
Come on.
And then lastly, just like remember your why.
Yeah.
Remember what Jesus did in your life, your testimony. I think sometimes in the overwhelming seasons when you're trying to lead and things start to feel really overwhelming, I think, again, just sorting through like, man, God, like, why am I doing this in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's how I show up with joy still.
Mm-hmm.
And I show up with like, it's all going to be okay because at the end of the day, God, this is your vision. This is your dream. This is, your purpose for me that like, if you picked me, you already knew every mistake I was going to make.
Yeah.
So I shouldn't beat myself up as hard as I do sometimes because you already saw that mistake happening. Yeah, I need to grow from it. But I think I found in earlier years, I limited myself to like taking risks because I was like afraid of messing it up.
Yeah.
Like when Pastor Chris asked me to be the business manager, I literally told him that is like the last thing I want to do. I was like, that feels pretty scary. Like, I don't want to sink the ship. And he was like, I don't think you're going to sink the ship. I said, yeah, but how do you know? And he's like, because I think the ship, ultimately, we have really good, like, systems and structures in place that are there to make sure you don't sink the ship.
Yeah.
But also, like, you're not the only one doing it. Like, this thing, we're going to catch each other and the mistakes. But also, he's like, ultimately, this is God's ship.
Yeah.
And like we just have to keep handing it back over to him. So it's not your your ship to sink.
Yes.
Like you got to keep giving it to God. And if you're running everything through God first, it's going to be pretty hard to sink it if you're getting his sign off on things. Like he already knows. And I was like, all right, fair. In reality, it's harder to live. Sometimes you're like, all right, God, is this the right decision at this moment? But knowing that, like, again, you can lay those hands on, like, all right, God, like, we feel peace about this decision. We feel like it's the next best thing. Maybe it feels like a risk. I feel like, man, I'm off tangent on something I wasn't going to talk about, but I just feel like even specifically, like, finances, and for those of you who feel overwhelmed by finance, I think that there is something there where it's like, man, if you're the ultimate provider, God, I have to keep putting it back in your hands first. Mm-hmm. But to put it back in your hands first, again, my husband teaches me a lot. And so we were praying one day about something, and he was like, actually, we hadn't started praying yet. We were talking about something, and he was like, yeah, I just, put it in God's hands. And then he goes, well, actually, that's not true. He stopped and said, let's pray. And then he prayed and was like, God, we put it in your hands. And I think it's so, it taught me, I was like, I think there are things with our money that we think that we've let God have control of, but we haven't even given him the control of it yet. Mm-hmm. We're still holding on to it our way. And I think when we release that, we say, all right, God, there are some big decisions to be made. And they feel overwhelming, and finances often like amplify that feeling, right? So like I feel like it's one of those things where you're like, all right, God, I actually have to give it back in your hand because you're the provider. And if I've done that, and then I've got it done, and I've prayed like, all right, God, give me the wisdom to steward it well, and you feel like you've gotten that God answer and that peace on it, then releasing it and stepping forward, even if it still feels risky or unsure, and you're like, all right, I'm gonna need the faith to do it. Like if you've done those two things first, you've been like, God, I put it in your hands, and you've asked him for like the best decision, then I think you have to just take the step, whether it still feels comfortable or not.
Right. Come on.
And I think I found that a lot in this business manager role. There's things where I'm like, don't ask me. But then it's like, oh, I'm the one who's supposed to, like, so they're like, Pastor Chris, why don't you just, he's like, well, what do you think? And I'm like, whatever you think, that's great. And he's like, no, I want to know what it is. And I'm like, no. And so, but then it also often locates, like, why are you afraid to say what you think about it? Or why is it that, and I'm like, and it often goes back to that very thing, like, I don't want God to feel like I messed this thing up, and God being like, but again, if you gave me control over it, if we've prayed on the next best decision for this church, you can't mess it up because God's ultimately ordaining it, right? And it's no amount of my wisdom or my skill set that could ever make it anything else. And so I think it's the same thing in whatever way, and just take that and like duplicate it to every part of your life, right?
Yes.
Relationship. I think there's some of you who are saying like, my relationship is in God's hands, but you haven't actually put it in his hands. And so like, God, you are the one who is the fulfiller. I think it was Pastor Chris who said like, your partner should be a complementer, not your completer, like the person who completes you. And our world tries to tell us, like, oh, he completes me. And it's like, no, he should be a great complementer to you. But if he's the thing that's completing you, that filling you, that's Jesus's job. Yeah. And so I think like for those that are looking to date, like, can you say like, I can go into that dating field already knowing that I'm complete and full in him, and all you're looking for is someone who's going to like complete that part of like the things that you can run in your calling for and like build a family together. And I think too many people are trying to shape it based on what they feel overwhelming about relationships, so they try to mold it into something so they can kind of control it a little bit. And God's like, I just need you to put it in my hands first and to pray on it, and then ultimately like those questions about, is this Mr. Right or Mrs. Right? Like, you just kind of keep taking those steps. I'm so off tangent right now, but I'm just like again, for like when I was dating Ichwa, no, I didn't know right away that he was the one, right? But every month that we were dating, it was like, God, I put this relationship in your hands. If it's not meant to be, take it.
Yes.
Like, that's fine. Yeah. Like, as hard as it is, that's fine. Like, I think like as you get further down in like your dating relationship, there are more feelings. So you're like, I want it to be fine, but you also have to like God, I put this in your hands, and then you're praying about it and you're running it past, like Pastor Jake was saying, those that you're vetting. Like, do you see any red flags? But actually listen when people say to what they see, because I think we want to be like, do you see any? Like, because I asked. But then I didn't listen to what they saw, right? Actually, like taking those things before God and be like, okay, like highlight that to me. Like, is this the person for me? And you just take it step by step. And I think then there is a moment where you kind of have this peace and this surety and this like, I could see myself having a family with them. I could see a future. I have a confidence in God. And so I think those kind of things, it's like all those overwhelming pieces of our life that build up, as we're leading through it, it's like you actually have to stop and take the time to locate like what it is about that thing that feels the most overwhelming for you. Whether it's relationship, finance, career. Some of you are stuck in careers because you're just too overwhelmed to take the next step in the career, And I've been there. I didn't want to, like, I was so done with my job on the trade desk. I would have quit like 2 years beforehand if you had asked me, because I was like, I knew that I was done, but I also knew that there was something next. But it was when I've talked about this before I preach, but like, it's funny how you're like, yeah, I'm so over this career, I don't want to be here anymore. But when the next thing came, when the job offer came to come to People Church, I was questioning everything again. Like, should I do this? And it was like, but God, had I put that in God's hands and actually prayed through it and be like, okay, God, what are the things that I'm still holding on to that I haven't put back in your hands? And I think that's ultimately what makes us feel so overwhelmed, is the things that we're still trying to control. And that also are things that like we put our identity in that should be a God identity instead. To complete us, there should be things that I think we say he is our provider, our healer, whatever it is, but then we find that in those moments that we're hit with that thing, we're like, oh, actually, God, I don't think you really are my provider in this area. I'm my provider, and I camouflage that I'm not because I tithe, but then when you ask me to part with something, it becomes a little hard because maybe I don't believe he's going to bring it back, whatever it might be, like those overwhelming things. Like actually taking it before God and doing the like hard soul work. And that's why I started this whole thing with like, you got to lead your soul first, because that's the area where I think it all starts to stem from. And when your soul's in a good place, there's really nothing that God could ask you for that it's still gonna feel hard in the moment. It's still gonna feel overwhelming, but you're gonna be able to be like, all right, God, like I can trust you with it. And I think we often struggle with that trust because we haven't gone deep enough. And that's ultimately where like that Holy Spirit transformation takes place, is you actually have to go into that secret place, in that deep soul space with God, and be like, here's the thing that's really holding me up about it. And until we identify those things and like address them, we're going to keep cycling through the same things that are overwhelming, that are too much. And I think as a leader, it amplifies even more because our people will see it before we even see it. You know, which is the hard fact of leading. It's like usually your people see your flaw before you often see your flaw. And it's like that feedback game video, and you're like, oh, when they tell you like, oh, you know, you seem a little disorganized, and you're like, no, never, I'm the most organized. And then you're like, yeah, no, I'm not. You're like, or I'm organized because I'm trying to control it.
Right.
And my organization is coming across as micromanaging, not organization. And so I think those kind of things that it's just like, again, really doing that soul space to lead well through times that I think put the pressure on it, through times that hit the nerve of something that's really going on deeper, and to show up well. So that's the Staffy, and you got some extra things in there that I didn't have in my notes.